Is somebody clicking something in the background or tapping or...
I'm tap dancing.
Clickety click, click, click.
Booyah.
Practicing my tap routine for the talent show.
This episode is sponsored by Component One, makers of Widgmo. If you need stunning UI elements or awesome graphs and charts, then go to widgmo.com and check them out. This episode is sponsored by Gaslight Software. They're putting on a Mastering Backbone training in San Francisco at the Mission Bay Conference Center, December 3rd through 5th of this year. This 3-day intensive course will forever change the way you develop the front end of your web applications. For too long, many web developers have approached the front end as drudgery. No more. We'll help you build the skills to write front-end code you can love every bit as much as your server-side code. Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 33 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have Jameson Dance.
Hey guys, I'm at Jurgensen on Twitter and jamesondance.com on the regular internet.
Awesome. We also have Joe Eames.
Coming live from a smoky, dirty basement. Joe, that's me.
A smoky, dirty basement, huh?
Yeah. My kids burned something today, and I need to tidy up my office.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that you went and worked for one of my former employers. Anyway, I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. The thing that I've been working on lately is an introduction to CoffeeScript. If you're interested in learning CoffeeScript, go to intro2coffeescript.eventbrite.com and sign up for the online training that I'm going to be doing next month. You can get early bird tickets through the end of this month, I think. So, we also have a couple of guests. Our first guest is Ben Comby. Is it Comby?
Comby, yes. Hey, yeah, I'm Ben Comby, at UnwiredBen on Twitter, and I'm the lead architect for the Enyo JavaScript framework here in Austin, Texas.
All right, and then we also have Gray Norton.
Yeah, hi. I'm Gray Norton, at Gray Norton on Twitter, and I manage the Enyo team from a sterile conference room here in Sunnyvale, California. No smoke or interesting basement projects going on here.
Awesome, and it looks like I missed Tim Caswell.
Hello, I'm here.
We all missed him.
My Skype says that it's still ringing Tim's Skype.
Interesting.
So he's only partially here, I guess. So this week we're going to be talking about, is it enyo.js?
That's right.
Do you want to introduce it a little bit? I've been kind of buried. I was out of town last week, and I've been catching up, and I haven't had a chance to look at it.
Sure. Why don't you give a quick intro, Ben, and I'll hop in.
Okay. Yeah, so Enyo is a JavaScript framework that my group here in HP has been working on for a while. It actually came out of the WebOS project, which, I'll remember the Palm pre-phone and then the touchpad that came out last year. When we launched the original pre-phone, we had the framework called Mojo that we had. So, the idea behind WebOS was that you'd build applications entirely in HTML and JavaScript, and they basically be running on top of a WebKit engine directly on the device. So we had this framework called Mojo, which was very much organized around the phone, around a small vertical screen, doing lots of lists, moving back and forth between different screens. That didn't scale very well to a tablet. And we had a team that had been working on this tool called Aries, which was a in-browser web development environment. And they kind of managed to somehow get this component-based layout system working with Mojo. But in the process of doing that, they ended up writing their own framework called Enyo. So we had the first version of Enyo came out with the touchpad last summer. And since the hardware was canceled last fall, the team kind of figured out, what do we do next? And so we released Enyo 2 in January as a cross-platform framework targeting all sorts of mobile devices, iOS and Android, but also targeting desktop web application development.
So is it kind of a competitor to things like Ember and Backbone?
Not really a competitor to Backbone. I think maybe we compete a bit against Ember. I think one of the ways to think about it is Enyo is very much around the idea of organizing an application into lots of components, reusable components, so you can take a bit of functionality out of one app, put it into another. So I think we kind of fit more into the world of a Sencha Touch, kind of a framework that does all of the rendering from JavaScript into your application DOM. Whereas I think a lot of other systems are more oriented around doing templates or annotating existing HTML files, adding functionality onto those.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm working with a company on a project right now that is using XJS, which is what kind of underlies Sencha Touch. And so from the layout in JavaScript perspective, for me so far, it's been a world of pain. I'm just wondering, is there a different mindset that you have to have in order to really make the layout in JavaScript make sense over just building some HTML and manipulating the DOM?
I think so. I mean, if you look at where we were coming from originally in designing this, we were starting with a visual designer. So rather than a person building a bunch of HTML, they'd actually start in our Aries tool and drag buttons around, drag input fields, basically kind of set up a UI in the application directly, similar like how you'd build an app in Visual Basic. And so the Enyo framework is very much organized around that idea that you're letting the JavaScript handle the rendering of all the HTML rather than thinking of the terms of pages and then going back and, you're kind of thinking at a different level than if you're working in HTML directly.
So you're thinking in terms of maybe components instead of page elements like divs and what have you?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, you're going to be creating divs and using the DOM, but you tend to organize your application around the actual UI elements that the user works with rather than the HTML items.
But I will say that Enyo actually sort of creates a bridge from the world that you're familiar with if you're accustomed to building UIs using HTML and DOM directly and sort of the higher level world of components. So the original architects of the framework spent a lot of time sort of discussing philosophical matters related to framework architecture. And one of the key principles behind the Enyo architecture is the notion that it's all turtles all the way down. And I think that's a quote from or a reference to philosophy. But the bottom line is that you can actually work very close to the DOM in Enyo if you want. So we have a UI library called Onyx, which sits on top of the Enyo core, which has a bunch of high-level controls that don't have direct analogs in the DOM, such as sliders and progress bars and things. But you can use sort of the base kinds or classes, to use more typical terminology, in Enyo directly without using the higher level UI constructs. And those can map more or less directly to the DOM nodes that you know and love, and you can style them using CSS.
Right.
So I worked on the Enyo team for about a year during the touchpad development. And at the time, there was no Aries for Enyo, so we had to write all our Enyo by hand. And it took me a little while to get used to, but once I learned the framework, it was really nice because you just make your components and then you plug them together. And for the built-in apps on the product, it was really nice because we could embed apps inside other apps. You could have this little panel that's like your Wi-Fi config, and it can be in the config app or it can be embedded in this other app. And since it's all componentized, it was really nice.
And can you do? And it sounds like you can do that with Aries on the web now, as opposed to on the tablet.
So we have the original Aries, which was built around Mojo and the phone style devices. It's still online. It's at aries.palm.com. So you can kind of look back and see where we came from. Aries 2 is the version that we're doing for Enyo development, and that is still in the process of being worked on. We're actually using the Ace editor that Cloud9, the company Tim's working with now, has been doing as kind of the editing component of that. So that's in development. You can check out the source code on our GitHub, but we don't have a demo version of that online right now.
There are some instructions though in the README in that repo, and it's actually not at all difficult to clone the Aries repo and get it running locally on your machine.
So this kind of leads me to another question. It seems like initially, since Enyo was aimed at the tablet and writing apps for the tablet as opposed to writing apps for the web. Well, two questions, and I'll ask the first one, then we'll move to the second one. Is there any chance that you'll be moving Enyo to some kind of desktop application development, or are you going to keep it strictly on the web?
So for desktop app development, I mean, the area we've been looking at a lot has been Windows 8, because Windows 8 comes with a JavaScript runtime and basically kind of its own like PhoneGap style container for doing JavaScript applications. the Windows 8 environment has some restrictions versus just doing standard web. They've kind of taken a lot of the content security things where you can't put into your inner HTML any script tags or event handlers directly, and a few other things like that, and just kind of gone full bore with trying to make sure that content can't mistakenly inject program code. So we're having to do some work around that. We're also, doing some work around just understanding any other restrictions Microsoft's done. But I think, we don't have a specific announcement about when we'll have a Windows 8 application version ready, but it's, something we're actively working on.
Let me take just a slightly different, angle on that question, though, because I think the key thing to understand about our vision for Enyo is that we're really looking to help developers build native quality, cross-platform application experiences using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS that can run really in any type of environment where you have a modern web runtime. So we're explicitly targeting mobile devices, phones and tablets, as well as desktop machines, and really, frankly, are agnostic with respect to whether an Enyo app at the end of the day is running inside a container like PhoneGap or a native shell of any kind, or in the Windows 8 runtime. And certainly, there are things we need to do to ensure that we work well in all those environments. But the bottom line is our objective is really to help people build great application experiences using pure web technologies that can run anywhere.
So I'm not very familiar with Enyo, but just from browsing the docs in the website, it looks like it's very much focused on mobile. But from hearing you talk, it sounds like the goal is to write once, run anywhere.
Where have we heard that before?
Well, that's what I was thinking too, right? But assuming you've written an Enyo app, I mean, what kind of changes do you need to make it work well on a small form factor and on just a desktop web browser too?
Well, there are a number of things that you can do to write an Enyo app in such a way that it will work well across different form factors. And certainly we don't claim to have a monopoly on good thinking in that area. So obviously, if you've been following the trends around responsive web design and all the techniques that have evolved there, virtually all of those techniques can be employed within an Enyo app, and we encourage people to employ them where they make sense, because after all, Enyo is, at the end of the day, just JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. To go along with that, there are a number of things within Enyo itself that make it easier to write UIs that adapt to different form factors. And probably the most visible, tangible one that I could mention would be the panels metaphor that we came up with when we were first moving from just smartphones on WebOS to smartphones and tablets. And the idea is essentially that you have an application UI which is laid out in logical panels that live typically in sort of a horizontal space, but that your viewport at any time is viewing, maybe on a phone, just one of those panels at a time, whereas on a tablet in landscape, maybe you get two panels on a tablet a tablet in portrait, maybe two panels. A tablet on landscape or a desktop, you may be able to view multiple panels at once, but from a user point of view, regardless of the size of your viewport, you get this sort of physical feeling for the space of these panels, and you understand as they slide in from the right, you can slide them back out to the left and move back and forth. And so that's a metaphor that we employed very consistently across the WebOS apps, and one which we find works well for a lot of different types of apps, particularly those that have any kind of hierarchical navigational structure. And so that's a construct which is built into Enyo as a first-class element.
I'd also add that another thing that we do is we have kind of a layout system. And so if you've done work in WebKit where you've used the Flexbox CSS, you know that that's kind of a very powerful way of doing app-style layouts. Well, we built a simple version of that, which we call Fittable, for doing a layout across components where you have like a few items that are fixed size, and then you want one other item to grow to the size of the container, whether that's the entire browser screen or just a part of the page that you're in.
Yeah, and the reason why we did that was simply because we wanted to ensure compatibility of Enyo apps across the widest set of platforms possible. And of course, if you're going back as we are as far as IE8, you can't be using Flexbox there.
So that's another question that I had was, what's the browser compatibility as far as you're only going back to IE8? Are you supporting all the versions of Firefox? What other browsers are you targeting?
So yeah, IE8 is as far back as we go for Internet Explorer. That's the last version that's available for XP systems. So that's kind of why we wanted to pick that as a baseline. For Firefox and Chrome, we generally mainly just support the most recent one. We're not supporting Firefox 3.6, and if you're on Firefox 4 later, you're in the upgrade system, so you're getting, moving to newer versions pretty quickly. The same applies to Chrome. For Safari, I guess we're basically supporting the most recent Safari and then one version back, because Apple isn't upgrading Safari for some of the older OS releases. And then we have a page on our site which lists the various compatibility things where we test occasionally on Opera, but we're not spending a lot of time with that. On mobile devices, we're kind of going back to Android 2.3, iOS 5 and 6 are supported. 4 best effort there, and then we've been testing on Windows Phone. Windows Phone 7, the browser has some issues that we're not really happy with, but we're hoping that Windows Phone 8 is going to turn out a lot better.
And when you say you're testing it, is that automated testing, or do you just kind of fire up an app and fiddle with it and see what doesn't work?
So fortunately, the nice thing about having the resources at HP is that we have a fairly large QA team. So we do have automated tests for a lot of the core stuff, but when you're dealing with UI differences in mobile devices, we basically have a team of dedicated testers that go continuously through and check on the different platforms and file bugs against us.
Right. So it is a supported project within HP?
Absolutely.
I'm a little curious about how that works. I mean, you hear about some of these, at least in the world that I live in, most of the folks that work on open source are generally employed by smaller companies. I do know people who are employed by larger companies like AT&T or something to work on open source stuff. Do they have some other way that they see that they're going to capitalize on this, either by putting out a commercial license, or is it going to be used on internal projects, or what's HP's benefit in this?
Yeah, so we're in the fortunate position on the Enyo side of really being a key enabler for a number of revenue-generating business opportunities, both within our business unit, which is essentially the former Palm, as well as elsewhere in HP. So, of course, in order to run the Palm business, we were shipping phones and tablets, and so in the process of doing that, we built, a full stack OS, WebOS, which we talked about. We built, of course, the Enyo application framework. We built a lot of cloud services that were backing the OS and the applications that ran on the OS. And we can't go into a lot of details on future revenue models because we're sort of in the process of relaunching the group now under its own identity and have some partnerships we can't talk about yet. But the bottom line is that our full stack OS and our cloud services both have significant revenue potential, and Enyo really is a necessary piece for making those things happen. And then we also are working pretty closely with HP's massive enterprise services business, and those folks are getting asked more and more by their enterprise customers to help deliver app solutions that run not only across different mobile devices, but potentially across desktop and mobile as well. And so Enyo is generating a lot of demand from within HP Enterprise Services as well. So we don't. It's not part of Enyo's charter to directly contribute revenue. And so really one of the key principles that we are operating under is that Enyo is and will remain completely free and open source.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So can I ask a question that I don't mean it to be offensive at all. I guess that's a bad way to prefix the question. I'm at like framework saturation, right? There are so many frameworks out there that have so many people like talking about how awesome they are that I feel like there's not room in my heart for another framework. Why should I, because there's a cost, right, to investigate new frameworks and new things that you're giving up the chance to build your skills in something else. So I guess two questions here. What kind of projects would Enyo work the best for, and like what makes it different than all the other frameworks that are out there, I guess.
Okay, well, I think the projects one is a bit easier just to kind of initially answer. Enyo is kind of a standalone system for building complex applications. So a good example is the email application we had on the touchpad. So that's dealing with a really complex data source, an email store. It's showing information several different ways. So it's kind of having to render both, a view of a email folder or this hierarchy of folders, then individual messages, and it wanted to have a consistent user interface for doing that. So, if you try to do all that directly in HTML, you end up with something which, might be functional, but you don't necessarily have all the nice UI bits that you'd have on a desktop application. So email was one of the most important apps on the touchpad, and Enyo kind of came around as like, how do we build all these components necessary to build something as complex as an email app or as complex as a spreadsheet application? The Docs2Go was built around Enyo. Sorry, not Docs2Go, that was QuickOffice. Docs2Go was on the older WebOS. I think it's when you're looking at the kind of these classical desktop style apps. I think you could do a really nice version of something like, what is the big Twitter client? TweetDeck, with its multiple rows of information coming all at you at once and kind of a constant rendering of different kind of data sources. I think, if you're building something that feels like a website, Enyo probably isn't the right framework. If you're building something that feels like a desktop application, then I think it's a great way of organizing an application.
Sure, that makes sense.
So can I jump on that for a minute? Because you're talking about like application look and feel or application style web apps, that look like desktop apps. I've never quite understood why you would choose that over maybe a native app. Are there reasons why you would pick one over the other?
I think the big reasons to go for a web-based application that looks like a desktop app, one of them is you automatically have this kind of cloud sync built in. I'm thinking like the Trello application, a to-do task manager. I can access that on whatever mobile device I happen to have with me, whether it's a tablet or a laptop or someone else's laptop, and I have something I can immediately jump in and deal with. Whereas if it was an installable desktop app, I'd have to figure out, okay, do I have a version for this operating system that's running? It might be on Tim's system where he's running his own custom Linux, and obviously there's no exe I could install. So I think that's one big advantage. I think the other one is just we're entering a system where if you have an application based on a website, it's a lot easier to maintain that, update it. So you have a point of sale system that's people are running on 15 different computers. Having it on the website means you update in one place versus having to build some sort of installer and update mechanism where you push changes out to all the different computers.
I think another point is just that it wasn't that long ago that we were doing the lion's share of our computing on desktop and laptop PCs. But obviously over the last 5, 6, 10 years, we're doing a massive amount of computing now on our phones and our tablets. And there's a whole wave of additional types of devices that are sort of undergoing that transformation now, things like TVs and cars. And I guess in our vision, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense over the long haul for either people who are developing apps or for people who are consuming apps if you have a lot of sort of walled garden ecosystems springing up around each of these different device platforms. And as a developer, you have to be writing native apps for 5 different platforms. And as a consumer, you have to, buy the same app on multiple different platforms, or at least, there's some cognitive load that comes around thinking about, well, if I want to get this particular thing done on my TV versus on my phone or my tablet, I might be using a different application. So to us, taking the long view, and we don't really claim that this is a transformation which, we can make ourselves or that it's going to be easier happen or overnight, but we really have a vision of the web as a universal platform for apps, and one in which you don't have to have compromises around user experience. So I think there's a great user experience that people associate with native apps for mobile and desktop platforms, and it's challenging to approach that on the web now, but we think that it's possible to come very, very close a lot of the time with a true cross-platform app, and we think that especially if we and people who share a vision like that keep pressing, we think that's the logical destination for all this, that the web really becomes the dominant app platform.
So I have a question about this. The goal is to make it an uncompromised experience, but I've done web on mobile and web on web-based apps and browsers for years and years. I've done this since the 90s. And the biggest problem I've had is performance. Do you think mobile will eventually get fast enough that it will perform fine?
I think we're seeing a trend in that direction. I mean, you look at the iPad 3 and you're dealing with something that is, a couple of orders of magnitude faster than the original iPhone, and that was just a few years ago. I think we're also getting to the point where mobile devices are really going to have the same computing power as desktops. I mean, it's just been amazing how much more powerful I think the mobile devices have become, as we reduce the chip sizes, as we, come with better power sources. And also as we figure out paradigms where we shift a lot of the computation work off the device that you happen to have in your pocket and push it onto your own personal cloud or servers that you work with out there. I mean, dealing with HTML, dealing with JavaScript, you are kind of putting an extra layer on top versus what you would get if you were coding directly, in whatever the native language of the device is. But I think as the web world learns more and more techniques, we've done a lot of optimization work in Enyo around things like how do you render lots of items into the DOM and have kind of a nice continuous scrolling experience. So we end up using kind of a combination of a flyweight pattern where we don't necessarily associate Enyo live objects with everything that we render, plus a paging system where if you're scrolling through a large list, we automatically have like a page of what's visible, a page of what's not visible, but you don't have that DOM filled with 50,000 items that you're not going to be seeing right now. So we kind of put them into the DOM just in time for you to view them, and then take them out so they don't get clutter memory. There's techniques like that can be done to make mobile or just make the web experience feel better. It's it's tough, but I really do feel like the computing power has been improving tremendously.
So I'd like to kick in here with some of my own personal experiences. When we built the Pluralsight's new HTML5 player, one of the things that we wanted to do was have the same code base running not only on the desktop, but on devices and on phones. And we pushed and we pushed and we pushed, and it just seemed like what we were trying to do was create a car that could also haul stuff, and what we ended up with is an El Camino, and nobody wants an El Camino. So, we ended up actually really writing a really great HTML5 player for the desktop, and I think it works actually pretty good on tablets, but on phones it just doesn't cut it, and we were making all kinds of considerations that make it work well on the desktop versus just the user experience is so different based on screen size and input. Keyboards and mice versus your fingers. That's a hugely different. And we had a really qualified UX designer working on the project with us, talking about how the different users would experience the application from the different types of platforms and how to make that work. And responsive design only goes so far. This is not a world where responsive design fixes the real issues of what's it like. A good native app on a phone or on a tablet is significantly better than a good website, unless you're talking about a very informational website. But an app like a video player, it just doesn't cut it. So do you feel like that we will really, as an industry, solve that problem, be able to do the write once, run we're not talking about OSs anymore. That when Write Once Run Anywhere came out, we were just talking about Mac, Windows, your Unix and Windows, and now we're talking about different devices and different input types. Do you feel like it just seems like the problem's gotten harder, and we've been trying to solve this problem now for 20 years?
Well, if you look at like what Microsoft's doing, they've kind of decided that touch is the primary input method going forward, and like Windows 8 seems to be deprecating a lot of the mouse and keyboard in favor of touch interaction, even on kind of their desktop apps.
Yeah, I think that's stupid.
Well, I don't know. I think if you look at where people are doing the majority of their computing, touch devices are starting to really overtake the desktop, except for people that are kind of needing a desktop or laptop style device because they're creating or editing a lot of content or programs, those kind of things. Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see a lot of applications that tend to be touch or very touch responsive first, and then kind of have affordances for more desktop mouse type use.
So that's an interesting answer, because basically what you're saying is, or what I'm reading between the lines, what you're saying is touch is going to be the primary interaction, and so likely we'll make concessions, and for people that want mouse and keyboard input, that will be the second tier citizen.
I think for a lot of cases that's going to be the case. I mean, I've seen initiatives where people are trying to run Android applications on AMD processors as part of Windows now. And even though you can hook a mouse and a keyboard up to an Android device, touch is primary there. And yeah, I really feel like touch is kind of the future for interaction for the majority of users.
Well, and I would also say, though, that even if true sort of touching the screen type of interaction doesn't take over the desktop world, which I suspect it may not, I think the experience of using, for example, the trackpad on a newer Mac laptop, in many ways, physically has a lot more in common with using a touchscreen device than with dragging a mouse around a desktop. And I think we are seeing a convergence of sort of UI patterns where really the latest versions of OS 10 and of course Windows 8 is a really obvious example, are starting to adopt patterns that became popular on touch-only mobile devices. So I think the distance between a desktop user experience and a phone and tablet user experience is closing. So to get back to your question, do you think we're going to solve these admittedly very difficult problems, around write once and run anywhere? I can't say absolutely that we will, but I feel like definitely not if we don't keep trying really hard. And that's not to say that every single app developer out there should be investing a lot of their effort in trying to do this, because you've got business goals and deadlines to meet, and in many cases, it may not make sense to venture off into these uncharted territories. But I guess we see ourselves as really focusing on pushing that ball forward, because we think the destination is one that's well worth reaching, and if one doesn't keep pushing on it, we won't get there.
So I collect gadgets, as many of you know, and one of my most recent gadgets is the MK802-2, which is basically an Android device on a stick. You plug it into your TV via HDMI, you plug in a USB keyboard and mouse, and you got a computer. And it's been very interesting using ice cream sandwich interface with a keyboard and mouse. And at the same time, I've been working on Cloud9 IDE experimental interfaces, and I want a tree view that's mobile friendly. So as long as you only use clicks, only have big targets, don't rely on double click or right click, you can have an interface that works on desktop or on mobile, whether they're using a mouse on mobile or a touchscreen on mobile, or it doesn't matter. There's an intersection of interfaces that work on both. And while a fully optimized app, you may have to customize the desktop and mobile versions, you're still saving a lot of time if it's the same code base with just customizations, instead of like rewriting it in Objective-C and then rewriting it again in C++.
Personally, I hate that idea, just because being a programmer, I'm often a power user in applications, and taking the lowest common denominator of input devices or of input methods is basically just removing all the features that are useful, that make it a power user, let you do that.
Well, I mean, you can have the other stuff on top of it. You can still have a right-click menu for devices that have right-click, but if you want your same app to work on multiple devices without rewriting everything, then you got to stick to something that works on everything.
Right.
Yeah, well, and if you can, the more you can simplify it, the easier the code is to write and maintain. So, there's definitely a trade-off, and if it's buggy because they've reached too far to provide those features, then it's a different, it's just as bad as if they don't have enough features.
Yeah, to me, it reminds me of the nightmare of a manager saying, hey, great, using this technology now we can build the best possible app on 6 different things and I only have to pay a quarter as much.
Yeah, we've all seen that work, right?
I mean, I think it goes back to the question, what problem are you trying to solve when you build an application as well? I mean, there are certain applications where maybe it doesn't make sense to show the same thing on a desktop or a tablet or a phone. And, it just depends entirely. I mean, do you want it to be accessible on all the devices but work well on one, or do you need totally different ideas about how you deal with your information depending on what kind of screen you're viewing it on?
I think that's very true, Ben. You kind of bring up a good point, and that is it really varies by the app. Some apps just work great. A lot of things are going to work great on multiple devices. Like here in Salt Lake, there's a theater company called Megaplex Theaters, and they have an HTML5 website that you hit on your phone, and it works fantastic. Just a great website. And it works great on the phone, it works great on the iPad, and then I don't know if their desktop, they're using responsive design and cutting out things, or if their desktop site is really different. But, something like that's perfect. Obviously, when it comes down to a coding editor or something like that, I would cry the day that's implemented the same across multiple platforms.
Right. So we're running out of time a little bit. I mean, we still have another 5 or maybe 10 minutes that we can talk, but I want to make sure that we're covering all of the different aspects of Enyo. One question that I have, because we've talked a lot about sort of the widget or app reusable chunk of code or reusable interfaces. I'm wondering, do you provide any mechanism for themes, or do you just expect people to use CSS?
So that's actually a good question. So the Enyo core really doesn't have any UI. Then we have our Onyx widget set on top of that, which does provide a very definite user interface that our HI designers inside of the Palm group figured out. The 2.1 release, which is what we're finishing up this week and next week, now has support for less style theming. So we kind of went through and took all the CSS our designers came up with and parameterized it and provide instructions on how to modify the variable set to do a custom version. But the framework is set up so that you can define your own widget sets. I mean, we've had developers in our community go and take the look and feel of the original WebOS phones and turn that into a widget set. So it's, we kind of provide a base UI class for common form elements. So if you create a new widget set, you want to follow that. But we kind of designed it from the start that you could have different look and feels plugged in and use those as your own components.
All right. The other question I have, as far as the kind of the reusable, I don't know what the right term is, widget or mini app within the main app or whatever. So are you aimed more at sort of a modularly designed application? Or, if I do have an app that takes up the whole screen and provides different, maybe just lists all the people in my list of clients or, whatever, do you have elements that are aimed more that way for a large one screen, one widget app?
Actually, I think a good example, we have an application called Sampler that shows all the different samples for the different widgets. And so each of those samples you can run in its own web page, but then you also have a view there where you can navigate through the hierarchy to find a particular sample, and then it shows up on the side of the screen in its own area. But then you can click buttons at the bottom, which then show you the source for it or launch it in a new window. So, I think you can totally do this kind of a collection of applets design with Enyo pretty nicely, but that's not the only way of designing your app.
All right. So one other thing that I want to aim at here real quick is, and this was way back at the beginning of the show, I said I had 2 questions, and I asked you one, I didn't ask the other. The question is basically, do you feel or maybe the better question is, how do you feel that coming from more of a Palm WebOS based background, how has that colored the design of what is now web technology?
Well, I think the focus on trying to build native quality app experiences using web technologies on even a very even on a device that has relatively limited computing power is that's probably the way in which our Palm legacy is informed our direction the most, because when we launched WebOS 3 years ago, we made the decision to make our native app runtime, the web stack. And yet, when consumers and, reviewers were looking at our app experience, they were, of course, comparing those apps to the apps on iOS and Android and other OSs where they were using a native development stack. And so we were in a situation where we really needed to squeeze every last drop of performance and polish out of the web stack. And so, I guess my answer is that, we were really focused on creating an app-like experience and coming as close to that native experience as we could. And so a lot of the decisions we made about, the nature of the framework and the set of problems that we've chosen to focus most of our time on, were driven by coming from that place.
All right, cool. Any other questions that you guys have before we roll over to picks?
Yeah, I've got a question. The same question I ask every week. What's the best way for people to go about learning enyo.js? What's the best learning path, and kind of what's the learning curve like, time-wise, for getting into enyo?
So we have a basic tutorial up on our website, which is enyo.js.com, which will take you through. I think right now we have it building a Twitter search application, but we're going to have to rewrite that at some point in the future because of Twitter's API and terms of service changes.
I just want to point out, former panelist on this show, Yehuda Katz, he tweeted that Twitter user APIs are becoming like taxi medallions.
Well, we were using the search API for this, so that one never required any authentication, so maybe it'll stay alive, but we're definitely violating the terms of service and displaying tweets. So we have that tutorial. We also have a very active user forums that's linked off our site, and I'm on there. Several of our other core developers are on there. We're, answering 20-odd questions a day from people that are exploring and trying things out. And then we have a huge number of former WebOS developers and people that have just stuck around with Enyo that are building apps that are, active there helping people as well. So I think that's the best way right now.
Yeah, so I'll mention, in addition to the tutorial, we have a growing set of docs in our developer guide, which you can find. Just go to enyo.js.com and click docs, and there's some good introductory material there to go along with the tutorial. And then Ben mentioned the sampler earlier. Definitely poking your way through the sampler, and you have the ability to view the source of any of the samples within the sampler at any time. So that's another great way to get your Enyo legs beneath you.
And I think once we have Aries 2 out the door, that'll be a really good way, because then you can visually build up something and see what the source looks like for it and then add a functionality.
Yay for generated code. Mm-hmm. So what kind of how long would you expect somebody, if they jumped in and needed to pick up enyo.js, how long do you think it would be before they were proficient enough to just, build an app without too much need for handholding or reference?
Well, we had a hackathon in Sunnyvale a couple months ago, and we came in with people that had no experience with Enyo, or maybe just had looked at the website and had built up some sort of application by the end of the day. So, I think you can get a feel for some basic stuff pretty quickly. I think the biggest thing we've seen has been developers that have come into Enyo without a lot of JavaScript or CSS experience. And so, we've not necessarily been having to teach them the framework, but teach them more about, how does an asynchronous method work? Or, why does my stuff not lay out the way I want it to? Things like that.
Man, I still ask those questions.
So one last question. Well, a few of us on the podcast tend to do things with, some of the best practices like testing and what have you. Does enyo.js play nicely with the testing frameworks that are out there for JavaScript? So
there's back when we were working on the touchpad, we were working with Pivotal, and they did a lot of work with, they built Jasmine. So there's been a lot of work with Jasmine. There's a basic test framework that's actually comes with Enyo, and it's, we use it for testing our core things. And we're starting to spend some more time with some of the tools which let you do testing in a browser core, running on a server. But we don't have a lot of great experience to pass on about that yet. It's still kind of in process.
Right. And I would imagine also that just by the nature of Enyo, some of the testing you can do automated. The right information is showing up, in the right elements or the right components on the page. But then also, since you're doing so much with the layout and look and feel, that you're obviously going to need some kind of visual inspection as well.
Definitely. But, we use test for a lot of the core component model that we have, a lot of the Ajax codes, underneath our own internal testing. So, we're in the middle of building out a better test suite for our own use, kind of going from the core outward. Right.
That makes sense. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that we should cover when talking about enyo.js?
I would just add that we have a really great community of contributors. We started off kind of very closed, just our own development team. But really, since we released the final version 2.0 back in June, we've been getting a huge number of pull requests from people, and we're very open about taking contributions that are good from the community. We also have a gallery on our website where something that doesn't necessarily go into our core code but is still useful for other people, we have a way of highlighting that, and you can go to enyo.js.com/gallery and see about 60 different user contributions that we've accumulated so far.
If somebody wants to contribute, what's the best way of doing that? Just checking out the code, looking at your tickets or bug lists, and then picking one, or would you rather have them talk to you first?
I think engaging with us first is a very good idea, because we have some directions that we published about where we're looking at. We're in the middle of doing a pretty significant integration with Backbone to provide some sort of MVC model for the future. So someone duplicating that MVC type work probably wouldn't have as much chance of getting it accepted. But if you just want to build your own UI widget, and have that exposed to other people, just go at it and talk to us on the forums. And the way to add something to the gallery is submitting a pull request to us, updating the gallery metadata. So it's very easy.
Okay, cool. Was somebody else trying to jump in when I asked my question?
I was just going to say that the gallery is definitely a great place to look, and I think Ben was right to bring up community, because while from the point of view of the sets of problems we're trying to solve, we may be closer to the frameworks from Sencha. We're actually huge admirers of the community model around jQuery, and so everything right down to sort of the enyo architecture, where we have this really relatively small, tight core, and then all of the functionality around layout and UI is built as optional libraries, is very much designed to encourage the community to help us build useful stuff on top of Enyo. So we definitely want community involvement of all kinds, and would love it if a few years down the road we can point to a huge and booming community of people who feel as invested in Enyo as we do.
All right, terrific. It looks like we're about out of time, so I'm going to move us along to the picks. Jameson, do you want to start us off with picks?
I can start us off for sure. So I just have 2 technical picks this week. One is a great article about MongoDB. It was on Hacker News the other day, I think. And I found that most of the articles on MongoDB, especially on Hacker News, are just people kind of whining about it. Like any other technology, it has strengths and weaknesses, and there's just this bandwagon that people love to jump on where they only talk about its weaknesses, but it does some things really well as well. And this article is called Things I Wish I Knew About MongoDB a Year Ago, which is just nice little performance tweaks and hacks and some cool features that I didn't know. It talks about the query profiler and the explain feature and some interesting things about how to use indexes correctly and stuff. So that's my first one. My second one is a GIST blog post about promises by Dominic DeNicola or something. But he talks about some of the purposes that, or some of the roles that promises fulfill in helping you manage async code, and how lots of promises implementations don't get them right. And I'm not super familiar with promises, so it was really helpful for me to understand a little bit more about how they work and how they can help you manage async code without dealing with callbacks as much, or nested callbacks as much. So them's my picks.
Awesome. Tim, what are your picks?
I'm going to pick the MK802 Android stick because it's really fun to hack on, and you can get the original for under $50 on Amazon. And
you say stick. What does that mean?
It looks like an oversized USB stick, except it has HDMI on the side. You just plug it into your TV.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant like a poll or something.
No, not exactly. But yeah, it comes with ice cream sandwich, and you can also boot custom ROMs on there. You can boot from Ubuntu or whatever. Someone ought to put WebOS on there for fun. But I don't know. It's a fun hackable device.
Cool. Android on a stick. Keep it cool so it doesn't melt.
Yeah, it gets pretty hot.
All right. Were there any other picks?
That's all I got.
Okay. Joe, what are your picks?
My first pick, which I've already picked before and is a little self-serving, is Domo. And the reason I'm going to pick Domo is because our boss just announced this week that he's giving everybody a Christmas break. And so we all have from the 22nd through the 1st off over Christmas, which is like 11 contiguous days. Of course, 4 of those are weekend days. But I was pretty happy to hear about that. So my wife and I are going to go someplace cool. So I'm going to pick Domo.
Is that a recruiting call?
That is a little bit of a recruiting call. But
Okay.
mostly just a neener that I get a Christmas break, and you guys probably don't.
I'll have to talk to my boss. He's kind of a jerk, but I might be able to work something out.
Your boss is a huge jerk. I don't think he's going to be considerate of you at all. My second pick is, I'm just going to repick what Jameson picked last week, XCOM. I bought it mostly because of what Jameson said.
Yeah.
And I have completely ceased all extracurricular programming activities because of it. And on the same vein, when I can't play XCOM because I'm not at my desktop or on my laptop, then I've been playing this iOS game on my iPad called Kingdom Rush, which is a tower defense game, but way better than any tower defense game I've ever played. Totally awesome. And then my last pick, which is back to programming, is the book The Clean Coder, which is completely awesome. And the second book on saying no made me realize the last 15 years of my life as a programmer has been completely me lying to everybody I talk to.
Liar.
Liar, liar. My pants are on fire.
Is that where the smoke in your basement is coming from?
I think so.
All right. All right, so I've got a couple of picks here. The first one is Tweetbot. They just released in the Mac App Store, and I think it was released today. Yeah, today. Released October 18th, 2012. Anyway, it's $20, but the interface is smooth, clean, and nice, and it does lots of cool stuff. So anyway, I really like it, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's in the Mac App Store, like I said. And then the other thing that I want to pick is I just bought a whole grundle of stuff from Amazon, and the reason I bought it was because I'm going to be doing a podcasting club for my son's elementary school. And so I just wanted to share some of the stuff that I bought. Now, I already have the Mackie 802 Xenix 802 mixer. And I bought a new mixer. So that's the old mixer that I used to use on these shows. In addition, I bought, I don't know if I'd say they're inexpensive, but they are less expensive than like the top end professional microphones. I got 2 of the Shure SM58 microphones. They're about $100 a piece. And then I got some windscreens for those. I also picked up, I have an extra pair of headphones. I've replaced them with the ones that I use now. I use some pretty nice ones. But anyway, so I picked up some JVC Super Aural headphones. So they're over-the-ear headphones. You just get better sound out of those. And then I picked up a Griffin iMic, which is just a USB sound card. And that way I'll have 2 inputs and 2 outputs audio-wise for my laptop when I go to do the recording and stuff. And that way I can pipe stuff in and do some cool audio effects with the kids. Maybe talk to them about how to, put a soundboard in and stuff and just make it all work, so that we can get some recordings in and get them podcasting. So those are my picks. I'll have links to all that crap from Amazon in the show notes. And then we still have the guests to do their picks. So Ben, why don't you give us your picks?
So I have 2 picks. One of them is a Parrot AR drone. I was just out at JSConf EU in Berlin last week, and the people were hacking on these. And basically I saw a guy, had a Wii controller hooked up to an Arduino, hooked up to a Mac running Node, which was then controlling the AR drone. And they basically were using that to try to get the drone to hit a big button when pressed was going to open source a project on GitHub. And after about 5 minutes of flying around, We finally hit the button, but then the script that button ran wasn't tested and failed out. But the drone itself was very cool. Second pick, in addition to JavaScript Jabber, one of my favorite podcasts is called Video Games Hot Dog. And it's done by the guys who do the Kingdom of Loathing online game. But it's just basically an incredibly funny look at what people are playing video games, both new and retro. And, it's what I listen to when I don't have time to actually play any video games myself.
Awesome. All right. Gray, what are your picks?
Yeah, so I have to admit to have that I just sort of was racking my brain for picks while you guys were making yours. So they're going to come a little bit out of left field, but there's a couple of useful Mac apps that I've just started using. So we have a really active discussion area in 37 Signals campfire room that I've historically had a really hard time keeping on top of until recently I tried this Mac app called Flint, which for whatever reason for me it's made all the difference. I'm actually able to stay on top of the campfire discussion without ruining the rest of my day. So just super clean interface that I can look at when I have the time, so that's been good. I also recently moved. I've been trying to find a good GUI Git client that I like, and having messed around with a couple, including most recently SourceTree from Atlassian, on the recommendation of another team member, I recently tried Gitbox, and so far so good. I'm liking that super clean GUI interface for Git. But probably sort of the most enthusiastic announcement I could make is like coming from way outside the tech world, unless you consider just the fact that it sits on a piece of optical media to be a technical tie. But the bottom line is I've really been enjoying an audiobook. It's actually Rob Lowe's autobiography, Stories I Only Tell My Friends. And, kind of random, my wife listened to it and loved it, and I've never had, been a particular Rob Lowe fan, but it turns out super interesting guy, super articulate, and to hear him read, some super interesting stories of his life has kept me sitting in my car outside the office after I arrived the last couple of mornings. So highly recommend that.
Awesome. And we'll have links to all that in the show notes as well. So real quick, we'll wrap this up. I don't think there are any announcements. I just want to remind folks that you can go do my Intro to CoffeeScript course, and that's intro to CoffeeScript.eventbrite.com. Oh, you have an announcement? Go ahead.
The Node Knockout is coming up. It's similar to the Rails Rumble, where you just hack for a weekend on a project with the team, and you just compete to see who can make the coolest thing. I don't really enjoy the competition part. It's more just to get together with a bunch of people and make something awesome. I think there are still some open group spots. So if you go to nodeknockout.com, you can see more information about it. It's the weekend of November 10th to the 12th, I think. So it's coming up soon, and it could be a great way to learn more about Node and JavaScript if you want to join the team and jump on.
Awesome. Sounds terrific. All right. Well, we'll wrap the show up. Thanks for coming, Ben and Gray, and we will catch you all next week.
Thanks.
Thanks.
See ya.
All right, see you guys around.